Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping right into dopamine.
hmm
That molecule that seems to be behind everything, motivation, focus, feeling good, maybe even addiction.
Yeah, it plays a huge role in so much of our experience.
We've been looking at some really detailed materials in this,
Yeah.
and our mission today really is to break it down, cut through the noise, and give you something useful, some actual tools maybe for understanding your own dopamine.
Absolutely. And I think the first thing to clear up is this common idea of dopamine hits.
Ah, right. Like you
Yeah,
get the sudden jolt of pleasure.
exactly. But it's actually more nuanced. The source material makes a great point. There's usually an underlying level of dopamine, kind of a baseline.
Okay, a baseline, like a steady hum.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's the tonic release. And then you get these temporary increases on top. Those are the peaks, the phasic release.
Okay, baseline hum, peaks on top. Got it. So it's not just about those big moments then.
Not entirely, no. And crucially, how those peaks interact with the baseline is, well, it's everything.
How so? What's the interaction?
Well, the key thing, and this is really important, is that after a big peak in dopamine, that baseline level tends to drop.
It drops below where it started.
Often, yeah,
Yeah.
temporarily. And that drop has a big impact on how motivated or satisfied you feel afterwards.
Uh-huh. That feels a bit counterintuitive. You have a great experience, get that pick,
Mm-hmm.
and then you actually feel less driven for a bit.
It can happen, yeah.
Yeah.
It sets the stage for a kind of temporary lull.
So why should you listening care about this up and down, this peak and baseline thing?
Because it connects directly to your everyday life. Understanding these shifts helps you understand your mood right now, what actually pushes you towards goals,
Yeah.
Your drive.
Your willingness to put in effort?
Exactly. Your willingness to engage. It's really fundamental to how we're wired.
The source material also calls dopamine a neuromodulator, not just a neurotransmitter. What's the difference there? Why does that matter?
Yeah, that's a great distinction. So think of neurotransmitters like very specific messages between just two neurons, very local.
Okay. Like a direct phone call.
Right. But neuromodulators like dopamine are more like a broadcast announcement. They can influence large groups of neurons all at once,
Ah, so a much wider effect.
a much wider effect.
Mhm.
Dopamine literally changes the probability that whole circuits in your brain will be active or inactive.
Wow. So it's kind of adjusting the overall state of the brain in certain areas.
You got it. Which explains why it can affect so many different things. Mood, motivation, focus.
So psychologically speaking, what are its main jobs then?
The source really highlights motivation, drive, and craving. Those are kind of big three from a psychological standpoint.
Motivation, drive, craving. Okay.
But it doesn't stop there. It's also involved in how we perceive time, which is pretty fascinating.
Time perception, how does that work?
Well, the exact mechanisms are still being worked out, but changes in dopamine levels definitely seem to alter our subjective feeling of how fast or slow time is passing.
That's wild.
And the source also mentioned something important. Being able to tap into dopamine over different time scales, not just quick hits, seems linked to avoiding addiction and sustaining long-term effort.
Right, right. And more fundamentally, dopamine is critical for movement too, isn't it? The source mentions Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia.
Yes, tragically, those conditions show just how vital dopamine is, specifically in what's called the nigrostriatal pathway.
Okay, that's one of the main dopamine routes in the brain.
Exactly. It runs from the substantia nigra to the dorsal striatum. When the dopamine neurons there are lost, you get the motor symptoms, the tremors, the stiffness, difficulty initiating movement.
And it's not just movement, right? Because dopamine affects mood too.
Absolutely. People with Parkinson's often experience depression and apathy, that lack of drive, which is also tied to the dopamine depletion.
So we have that nigrostriatal pathway for movement. What's the other main one?
That's the mesocortical limbic pathway.
Yeah.
This is the one more heavily involved in motivation, drive, craving, what people often call the reward pathway.
Ah, involving the nucleus accumbens, that area.
Precisely. It goes from the ventral tegmentum to the nucleus accumbens and parts of the prefrontal cortex. This pathway gets activated when we're pursuing goals, relationships, learning, achievements. It's also heavily implicated in addiction when it gets dysregulated.
Okay. Two main pathways. And how does dopamine actually get released within these pathways? Is it always the same?
Good question. The source points out two modes. There's synaptic release, that targeted neuron-to-neuron communication we mentioned.
The direct phone call.
Right. But there's also Volumetric release. This is more like that loudspeaker dopamine floods a general area, affecting many neurons nearby, even if they don't have a direct synaptic connection.
And I imagine that difference matters when we talk about things that affect dopamine levels, like drugs or supplements.
Huge difference, yeah. Substances that boost dopamine can affect both types of release, and often the volumetric release is strongly affected.
Which messes with that peak to baseline ratio we talked about.
Exactly. It can really throw it off.
Yeah.
You might get a massive peak from flooding the system, maybe some short-term motivation, but it might not feel truly satisfying and can make that baseline drop even more severe.
So it's not just about the amount of dopamine, but the dynamics, the peak relative to the baseline.
That's the core idea for satisfaction, yes.
Wow.
The height of the peak relative to your baseline seems crucial for how rewarding something feels. Just cranking up overall dopamine isn't the whole story.
The source also mentioned dopamine receptors being slower. G protein-coupled receptors. Why is that significant?
Yeah, that's a bit technical, but important. Unlike some neurotransmitters that use really fast ion channels, dopamine mainly uses these G protein-coupled receptors. They trigger a slower cascade of events inside the cell.
Okay, slower. So the effects last longer.
Potentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, these slower cascades can actually lead to changes in which genes are turned on or off in the neuron.
Whoa, gene expression. So dopamine can cause longer-lasting changes in how brain cells function.
It can. It helps explain why dopamine's influence can be quite profound and enduring, not just a fleeting signal. It's like a switch that takes longer to flip, but stays flipped for a while.
And there's another chemical involved too, right? Working with dopamine, glutamate.
Yes, good point. Dopamine neurons often release glutamate alongside dopamine. Glutamate is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter.
Meaning it ramps things up, makes neurons more likely to fire.
Exactly. So this co-release likely contributes to that feeling of energy, alertness, readiness, that sort of sympathetic arousal you get when dopamine is high.
Okay, so if we try to boil it down, what's the simple takeaway message about dopamine?
The source gives a nice summary. It's the molecule that drives you to seek things outside yourself, things you want, need, or desire.
Right, pursuing things.
Yeah. And generally, low levels correlate with low motivation, while high levels correlate with excitement, anticipation, even if there's fear involved. It's like a universal currency for tracking progress towards goals, tracking pleasure.
A universal currency, I like that.
And your current level, relative to your recent past, really dictates your drive and maybe even your subjective quality of life in that moment.
Which brings us back to why just chasing dopamine hits can be problematic.
Precisely. Because, as the source stresses, if you keep hitting those peaks over and over with the same thing, that baseline tends to drop.
Making it harder to enjoy the same thing next time. Or even other things.
Exactly. Your threshold for enjoyment goes up because your starting point, that baseline, is lower. It's a really key concept that gets missed a lot.
Okay, let's dig into those longer-term consequences then. This peak and baseline cycle. Is there an evolutionary reason for it? Why the drop?
Oh, absolutely. That drop isn't a bug. It's a feature. From an evolutionary perspective, if finding food once made you feel totally satisfied and unmotivated forever.
You wouldn't look for more food. Not good for survival.
Exactly. That slight dip after the reward, that feeling of, okay, what's next, is what keeps us seeking, exploring, striving. It drives further behavior.
And the size of the drop is related to the size of the peak.
Generally, yes. The bigger the peak, the more significant the subsequent drop in baseline tends to be.
Which leads to this idea of a dopamine set point you mentioned. What does that mean for us?
It's this idea that your average baseline level of dopamine isn't necessarily fixed forever. If you repeatedly expose yourself to massive dopamine spikes, think certain drugs, maybe even intense behavioral addictions.
Like gambling. Or maybe even extreme video gaming.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
The concern is that this can gradually lower your overall dopamine set point. Your everyday baseline gets dragged down.
And the result is less overall joy, less motivation for normal stuff.
That's the potential risk. Even without a full-blown addiction, you might find it harder to get pleasure or feel motivated by the simpler things in life that used to satisfy you. Your threshold for feeling good has been raised because your baseline is lower.
So you need bigger and bigger thrills just to feel.
That's the worry. It connects to what Dr. Anna Lemke talks about in Dopamine Nation, that pleasure-pain balance.
Ah, right. The pain isn't just physical pain. It's that craving, that wanting that comes after the pleasure.
Precisely. That feeling of dissatisfaction is physiologically linked to the dopamine dropping below baseline. The source also mentions the neurobiology, the readily releasable pool of dopamine vesicles.
Vesicles, like little packets holding the dopamine.
Yeah. When you have a huge release, you temporarily use up a lot of those readily available packets near the synapse. It takes time for them to get refilled and ready again, contributing to that dip.
So constantly chasing big spikes. The consequences can be pretty serious then.
They can be. Lower baseline, less pleasure from everyday life, potentially spiraling into addiction. The source used video games as an example many can relate to.
Right, and it's not just one activity in isolation. What about the work hard, play hard idea? Pushing hard at work, then going all out for fun.
That's a really important point the source makes. That cumulative effect can be draining. If you're getting big dopamine hits from work achievements, then layering on intense socializing or gaming or whatever.
You're constantly spiking and dropping.
Yes. And the overall effect can be a lowering of your baseline, leading towards burnout, even if each activity on its own seems fine.
Because dopamine is like one single currency for all this stuff?
Exactly. That's a crucial insight. It doesn't matter what caused the peak, a promotion, a drug, a thrilling game. It all feeds into the same peak and baseline system.
Okay, so if someone feels like their baseline has dropped, they're feeling flat, unmotivated, what's the path back? How do you replenish that dopamine system?
The most straightforward advice from the source is abstinence. Taking a break from the high dopamine activities that might be lowering the baseline.
Like a dopamine fast.
Kind of, yeah. The example given was a friend who cut out their phone, video games, social media for 30 days.
And what happened?
They reported significantly better concentration and mood afterwards. Gives the system time to reset, basically, to refill those readily releasable pools and let the baseline recover.
So when we do engage with things that give us dopamine, things we enjoy, what's a healthier way to approach it?
The key seems to be intermittent release or intermittent reinforcement. Basically, don't expect or chase that huge dopamine rush every single time.
Like how casinos work. You don't win every pull of the lever.
Exactly. That unpredictability is incredibly powerful at keeping behavior going. It taps into something deep in our wiring, probably from when finding resources wasn't guaranteed.
Dopamine reward prediction error, is that related?
Yes. Motivation is often highest when we expect a reward but aren't certain we'll get it. Intermittent schedules leverage this uncertainty perfectly.
So how could you use that intentionally, say, with exercise or work?
The source suggests varying the dopamine-enhancing elements. Maybe sometimes you listen to music when you exercise, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have coffee before work, sometimes not.
Ah, so you make the extra dopamine boosts unpredictable.
Right. So you don't become reliant on them, and you stay more sensitive to the natural dopamine release from the activity itself.
That makes sense. The transcript also mentioned the smartphone as this constant source of layered dopamine.
Yeah, that's a big one in modern life, isn't it?
Definitely, I feel that pull, that need to check.
Each notification, each scroll. It might be a tiny little dopamine release, but it's constant.
Layered on top of everything else.
Exactly. And the concern is that this constant low-level drip, this layering, might actually contribute to a lower overall baseline motivation and potentially even increase feelings of depression or anxiety for some people.
You mentioned removing your phone during workouts helped.
Yeah, the host in the source shared that personal experience. Removing that constant potential distraction and dopamine source seemed to improve focus and maybe even the satisfaction from the workout itself.
Okay. What about using things like caffeine or even stronger stuff specifically for boosting performance, like for studying or working out?
The source urges caution there, especially with chronic use of stronger stimulants for non-medical purposes.
Because it messes with the baseline long term.
That's the risk. It might give you a temporary edge, but it could undermine your intrinsic motivation and satisfaction down the road. Caffeine gets a bit of a nuanced mention, though.
Oh, how so?
Well, caffeine works differently. It mainly blocks adenosine receptors, which makes you feel less tired. But some evidence suggests it might actually upregulate certain dopamine receptors, specifically D2 and D3.
Upregulate, meaning it makes more of them, or makes them more sensitive.
Potentially makes them more sensitive or increases their number. So the dopamine that is naturally released might have a slightly stronger effect.
Interesting. So caffeine might not be depleting dopamine in the same way.
It seems less likely to cause that direct depletion and crash compared to, say, amphetamines. Yerba mate also gets a mention. It has caffeine, but also antioxidants. And some studies hint it might even protect dopamine neurons. Plus, it affects GLP-1, which has its own links to dopamine.
But there's a warning about caffeine too, right? With MDMA.
Yes, a serious warning. Because caffeine might upregulate those dopamine receptors, combining it with MDMA, ecstasy, which causes a massive dopamine release, could potentially make the MDMA more toxic or dangerous. Definitely not a good mix.
And what about those stronger drugs like amphetamine, cocaine, long-term effects?
The source cited a pretty striking study suggesting that using these drugs can actually impair neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and learn.
Exactly. The massive dopamine surges and subsequent crashes caused by these drugs seem to limit the brain's ability to adapt and form new connections afterwards. It's a strong cautionary note about using these substances outside of a proper clinical context.
Okay, so let's shift away from the risky stuff. The discussion then turned towards healthier, more sustainable ways to influence dopamine, specifically cold exposure.
Right, this was fascinating. People like Vincent Priesnitz way back and Wim Hof more recently have championed cold water therapy.
But safely, right. You have to be careful.
Absolutely. The source stresses safety, avoiding dangerously cold water, risk of cold shock or hypothermia. You need to ease into it.
So what did the research actually find? There was a study mentioned.
Yeah, European Journal of Applied Physiology, they had people immerse themselves in water of different temperatures, warm, coolish, and genuinely cold, like 14 degrees Celsius.
Okay, what happened in the cold water?
An immediate big spike in adrenaline and noradrenaline, that fight or flight response.
Makes sense. Feels like a shock.
Right. But then, a bit delayed but really significant, was the dopamine increase, up to 250% above baseline.
Wow. 250%? That's huge. Is that comparable to anything else?
The source actually compares it to the level of increase seen with cocaine.
Seriously?
Yeah,
But presumably without the negative side effects and the crash?
exactly. And crucially, this dopamine increase was sustained. It lasted for up to 3 hours after they got out of the cold water.
3 hours? That's remarkable.
It really is. There's also a temporary rise in cortisol, the stress hormone, as expected. But subjectively, people reported feeling more alert, clearer-headed, even calm after the cold exposure.
So the advice is, start slow, use water that's uncomfortable but tolerable.
Yes, that initial unpleasantness, that jolt of adrenaline, is part of the process that triggers the dopamine release later. You learn to tolerate the initial discomfort.
Okay, that's a powerful natural tool.
Right.
The final section of the deep dive really got into rewards, effort, and mindset.
Yeah, looking at the nature of rewards.
Yes.
Intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Like that Stanford drawing experiment, where kids who got rewarded for drawing actually drew less later on.
Exactly. It shows how external rewards can sometimes undermine motivation that was already there. Dopamine plays a role here too, maybe even related to that time perception thing we discussed.
Oh, so?
If your focus is entirely on the reward at the end of the effort, the dopamine release might become strongly associated only with the reward, not the process of getting there.
So the effort itself feels like just a chore, something to get through.
Precisely. It decouples the effort from the reward pathway in a sense. This makes the activity itself feel less enjoyable and makes you less likely to want to do it again for its own sake. It's kind of the opposite of a growth mindset.
So, developing a growth mindset, it's about learning to get dopamine from the effort itself, not just the outcome.
That seems to be the key idea. Learning to associate the feeling of dopamine release, that sense of drive, focus, and eventual satisfaction with the friction, the challenge, the struggle of the effort.
That sounds hard. How do you actually do that?
It likely takes conscious effort.
Yeah.
Self-talk during difficult moments, focusing on the feeling of overcoming resistance rather than just anticipating the finish line. The source really emphasized not trying to spike your dopamine right before you start difficult work or rewarding yourself immediately after.
Why not? Don't rewards help?
They can, but the idea here is to train your brain to find the reward in the process. If you layer on external dopamine spikes before or after, you might overshadow or prevent that internal association from forming. Learn to derive dopamine from the effort.
The example of intermittent fasting was interesting here.
Yeah, that was a great illustration. Initially, for someone starting intermittent fasting, the big dopamine hit is probably eating after the fast. That's the reward.
Right. Relief and pleasure.
But the source suggests that long-term practitioners often shift. They start to find a sense of accomplishment, discipline, maybe even clarity during the fasting state itself.
So they start attaching dopamine to the effort of not eating.
It seems like it. They reframe the experience. And knowing the potential health benefits, that knowledge itself can reinforce the dopamine release associated with the effort of fasting.
So it's about consciously reshaping our internal reward signals related to effort.
That's a great way to put it.
This has been incredibly insightful, really digging into how dopamine works beyond the simple headlines. What's the final thought you want to leave listeners with?
I think the most powerful, maybe provocative idea is this. You actually have the ability to consciously shape how your brain releases dopamine in response to effort. It's not just automatic.
We can train our dopamine system.
To some extent, yes, by focusing on the internal rewards of challenge and persistence, rather than just the external outcomes. So the final thought is, consider just one small area in your life. Where could you try shifting your focus away from the external prize and instead try to find and amplify the dopamine hit that comes from tackling the challenge itself? That shift might be the key to more sustained motivation and ultimately a more fulfilling experience.